Hola, muy buenas a todos y bienvenidos a este nuevo programa de Future Intelligence, nuestro apartado, nuestras secciones dedicadas al impacto de las nuevas tecnologías y en concreto de la inteligencia artificial en el campo de las artes, pero también en nuestra vida cotidiana. Tenemos la gran suerte de tener con nosotros hoy a un experto y un analista de estos fenómenos que además ha desarrollado toda una teoría en torno a nuestra percepción y nuestra representación en el mundo digital. Hoy tenemos con nosotros en Future Intelligence a Laurence Scott. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. How are you?
It's very nice to see you. I think it's morning. I'm hoping it's still morning. But who knows, in digital space, time is meaningless.
Exactly, and especially for our watchers connecting from different parts of the world. Actually, we are
Absolutely.
everywhere at any time, so that's
Yes.
fantastic. Very quickly, I wanted to introduce you, saying that you're an award-winning author of 2 books, The Four-Dimensional Human, that we'll be talking about in a few minutes, and Picnic Common Lightning. You write regular columning on digital life on Wired magazine, fantastic magazine, on tech and trends. And you are a presenter on BBC Radio 3 Arts and Ideas program, Free Thinking. You've received a doctorate in comparative literature from King's College London, and you teach writing and literature at New York University in London and on the University of North Carolina's honors program. You are not getting bored at all.
No, lots of things going on.
Let's start with our conversation. I was saying just at the introduction about your book, The Four-Dimensional Human. Actually, it was named Top 10 Nonfiction Book of the Decade by Wired magazine. Congratulations! And basically, the book deals with the very recent phenomenon in human life, the impact of new technologies on our cognition, our perception, our emotions. Can you tell us a little bit more? What's this fourth dimension?
Well, thank you for having me. It's lovely to speak with you in any time zone. And my friends were really surprised when I told them at first that I was writing a book on digital life and social media, because at the time I don't think I had a smartphone at the time. I was barely on social media, and they said, "What do you know about this? Why are you even writing about this?" And part of it, my compulsion to write the book, sort of around the mid 2014 period of that last decade, was because I felt almost from an outsider's view, even though I wasn't participating in digital life fully, I could still feel my body and my mind being changed by these technologies. So the book, The Four-Dimensional Human, began with, or the inspiration for it was a moment when I was traveling in Portugal with a friend, and I had just written a postcard to another friend, and I was waiting for the ink to dry. And my friend and I, who were in Portugal together, we were talking for a bit. And I noticed that my attention wasn't fully on what we were saying. And I kept looking over at the postcard that I had just written. And there was a strange set of emotions I couldn't quite isolate, but one of them was definitely anxiety. And I thought, what's making me anxious about this postcard? And when I began to think about it, as I was talking to my friend, I realized I was surprised that the person I'd sent the postcard to hadn't replied to it yet. So here we have this situation in which I was used to the rhythms of text messaging and that sort of the chronic anxiety I think that we all have of, do my friends hate me, or are they angry at me for some reason simply because they haven't replied to a message that you've seen, or a WhatsApp chat group or whatever doesn't seem to be acknowledging your comment. This postcard, which is an old form of communication, I hadn't even put a stamp on it. I hadn't gone to the post office. It was being projected onto it with a whole set of digital emotions. And I realized that my whole nervous system, the way I was approaching relationships, communication, was being subtly rewired, and that my expectations for how we communicate with one another were being really fundamentally changed. And I did feel that was a moment of useful madness, where I thought, why hasn't this person replied to my postcard yet? I thought there's something going on here. And that made me really interested in thinking, could I write a book which was a map of all these maybe minor emotions, these small moments that digital technologies were sort of how digital technologies were influencing us. And then I began to think about the title of the book really came first. The book grew out of a conversation with an editor at Random House. And I said, I just have this image or this phrase called the four-dimensional human. And what I meant by that was that it felt like there was another layer to experience that hadn't been around 5 or 10 years before. And it was the sense that every moment of our lives had a new side to it, a new angle to it, a new dimension to it. And a very simple way of explaining the fourth dimension is what I really call the world of being online, being on social media, engaging with digital technologies. I call that as a big umbrella term, the fourth dimension. But why I decided to call it that was because if you take the example of someone making their dinner, they think their dinner looks good, and they take a picture of it and put it online and say, this is what I'm having for dinner. Now, this is quite a cliched old example at this point, like Instagram is full of people's meals and stuff like this. But when I was writing it at the time, I thought, it's weird how that meal has a whole different life going on. So while I'm eating it in the three-dimensional world and tasting it, other people are looking at it in other countries at different times, long after my meal has gone cold or I've digested it, and they're commenting on it. And so it has this other dimension to it. It has this other life. And I felt that was a very simple, but sort of hopefully striking way of describing how our lives have become four-dimensional, that our regular three-dimensional lives, at any one moment, we can add this other dimension to them by converting them into a digital form, usually visually or as a video, and having other people comment on it. So I wanted to talk about what it was like to be four-dimensional humans. We were no longer living in the physical world of our rooms, of our tables and chairs. And not that we ever fully were either. We have always been other places. We've been able to imagine being in other places. The internet wasn't the first communications technology. We could talk on the phone to people across the ocean. But this seemed a really extreme version of being able to be in more than one dimension at once.
Well, actually, you're mentioning an aspect very important of your book. You explain that our relationship between the moment we live in our daily life and the moments we share on our social networks actually suffer some sort of distortion. So do you have the feeling that actually we're experimenting the present from a very different way? And what would be the consequences of this distortion?
Yeah, it is. It's a good way of putting it. That the idea of the distortion, because when people when we started going online in the 90s, and we had dial-up modems, and maybe we went to the family's laptop. You know, I was a teenager in the 1990s, so my family had a laptop at a desk, and or a desktop rather, computer, and I would go and sit at it and go online, and you'd hear the modem drilling. And I described it in the book as though the modem sound as you connect to the internet was like drilling through rock. And it was really like going to another place for a set period of time until someone needed the phone or you got kicked off, some other family member needed the internet. So it felt very separate. It felt like a place that you journeyed to from your regular three-dimensional world and then retreated back into more physical space. But now, as you say, with Web 2.0, with smartphones in our pockets, our daily minutes, our hours are constantly being distorted because we can be online anytime we want. We can pick up our phone and go on the internet. And I think this has huge repercussions or impacts on how we experience the body. I know one of the themes maybe of the festival at the moment is this idea of sort of the human image, the effects on the human body. And one of the first things that really struck me about us being four-dimensional humans was that being four-dimensional gave us a different relationship to our bodies. We could suddenly reach out across continents and sort of be in a sort of tactile contact with people through digital media. And one example that really struck with me was that when I was researching the book, a man in his 60s would talk about, or told me how he had once a week, I think he had sort of a FaceTime call with his little granddaughter, who was very young, under a year old perhaps. And they would talk via sort of a tablet type thing. And at the end of the call, she really loved talking to her grandpa, who she was never in the same US state as, and she would hug the iPad to say goodbye. And I felt that was an amazing image, potent symbol for how our bodies are being sort of fragmented and being displaced, how she felt that she could commune and communicate love to her grandfather in a tactile, physical way by hugging this digital device. Now, this is a child, really little child's view, but I think in general, we have, all of us to some extent, have some of that feeling of how our phones feel like a presence. I've had students write stories about how if they're missing one of their friends who they always talk to on their computer, that the hum of the computer's fan, the sound of the computer's mate can be consoling, almost like a heartbeat. Or, so there's this weird way in which our bodies are being slightly blurred with the digital technologies that we associate with people. Does that sort of make sense?
Absolutely, and especially I wanted to follow up on this aspect because do you think that we are developing some new sensitivities or new sensibilities because of our digital alter ego?
I think one of the funny things that's happening a lot, and this became really prominent during the pandemic, but I just want to take a few steps back from that, because I did notice when writing The Four-Dimensional Human that our senses were being cross-wired in a way. There's a condition called synesthesia, which many people may have heard of, which is where synesthetes experience one sense in terms of another sense. So they might see a word and associate very strongly a color with it, or they might hear a word and experience a taste in their mouths at the sound of the word. So that was synesthesia. And I felt that digital life was making synesthetes out of all of us, in a sense. And one good example to illustrate this is the idea of the mute button online, because I noticed that we were suddenly not muting just volume. If you want to turn your YouTube video off, you'll press the mute or whatever. But I noticed that the verb mute, which has to do with sound, is used online in a way that refers to sight. So if you don't want to see an ad anymore, like a fixed, unmoving, still advertisement on your Facebook feed or something like that, you can be asked to mute the ad. Or people's messages, if people are playing video games and messaging all the time, it can be seen that the messages which have no sound can be seen as a distracting form of noise, and other video gamers will mute the people who are commenting a lot in the chat. So this really fascinated me, because this seemed as though, if you want to take it to its extreme, it was as though we had mouths in our fingertips and ears in our eyes, this complete blurring of the visual, experiencing visual stimuli as a form of sound, as a form of noise, I think was a really significant cross-wiring of our sensitivities of our senses. There was a case in England around one of the Remembrance Days, so November the 11th, for the war dead, and there's usually a moment of silence, 2 minutes of silence, and during that time there was an automated tweet that went out from one company, and people were commenting saying, oh, this was very disrespectful that your tweet came out during these 2 minutes of silence. Now, a tweet, although it's called a tweet, a bird sound, they're actually silent. They're a visual object, and yet it was seen to puncture the reverent silence of the Remembrance Day services. So this strange way in which vision is being experienced as noise, to me, suggests a lot about how our senses are being rewired. During the pandemic, this became really more obvious when we were in various lockdowns and we were living so much of our life on Zoom. I actually wrote a wide column about that when the pandemic just started, which was about how in lockdown, living a Zoom life, you have to make vision, the visual sense was basically the primary one we had. We had sound as well, but vision became so important. All our contact with other people was a visual one, and we lost the crucial one of touch. You know, we couldn't, we were living a touchless life. We were living a very untactile life. And so what people found they were doing was that they were using their visual facial expressions almost as a form of hugging someone, a kind of embrace. And I was really interested in this way in which our visual senses were having to stand in for a whole load of other sensual experiences, and we had to communicate so much primarily through vision. So I think digital technologies necessarily, because they really only contain two senses of hearing and vision. And so they have to compensate. If we're living very solely digital lives like we were during the pandemic, then we have to find these mutated versions of our other five senses that have digital analogs in the visual.
Well, actually, with all the new technologies towards virtual reality, augmented reality, and haptic reality, actually, I think we are more and more going into and further in terms of having a sensitive digital world. Talking about the our own representation, but also our promotion, most of the time we are facing the rise of self-promotion on social networks, and many artists, but also common people, I would say, are becoming more and more their own PR, public relation agent. Are we reaching a point in which the concepts of individual identity and brands are merging?
Yes, I'd say so. That seems to be the way it's going. And it's easy to feel suspicious about someone, say on Instagram, who is creating a completely blurred relationship between private and public life. So their business becomes documenting their daily public lives, but inserted with it, if they're popular enough, if they have big enough followings, interspersed within their regular ordinary lives that are also very showcased and produced for Instagram purposes. There are commercial relationships which are at play. So they might be sponsored by certain people to promote certain brands. So that crossing of a private life presented publicly, but also interspersed with commerce, is a really interesting blend. And it can be really easy, I think, to be cynical or suspicious of such people. But at the same time, we have to be aware of what has been going on in the economy, the post-2008 economies, and the shrinking of opportunities, many of which job opportunities, many of which digital technologies have caused and provoked. So I don't like to be too sort of morally judgmental of people who are doing this, because people are having to find other ways to earn money, and commodifying private life has become one of them. But this seems to me very clear that the idea of the public brand has become completely normalized. And why that's so striking in terms of the trajectory of the internet and digital life is that in the utopian dream in the 90s of the internet was for cyberspace, as it was called then, to be a place of exploration, a place where you were sort of disembodied, where you could occupy all sorts of multiple identity positions. You could put on different masks for play. You could be other people. That was the dream of a place without borders, without bodies. That was the vision. However, the corporatization, the commercialization of the internet was always going to be against that. So as soon as capitalist infrastructure went online, we had to buy things, we had to show up and be consumers, then that dream of a shape-shifting, changing self was always going to go. one thing that capitalism loves is a fixed person, is fixing their ideas of who you are, what your tastes are, who you like to listen to, what you like to buy, etc. So that fixing of the self became very important very early on. And that to me was driven by the commercial demands with which we were engaging in on the internet. So for instance, in order to participate fully in the way that the Web 2.0 went, long after the dream of the 90s where you could be anyone online, if you wanted to book an Airbnb room, you had to be yourself. That had to be, you had to be verifiable. Your name had to be linked to your image, to your identity. There were all sorts of ways in which anonymity was treated very suspiciously by the economic and commercial structures of Web 2.0. And so when you talk to me about, or you ask me about the idea of the person as the brand, in a way, the architecture of digital life demands that we have that stability, that instant knowability of a brand. In the four-dimensional human, I write about it as though we have a chain store self that we're allowed to manifest in all sorts of places online, as long as we're always the same person. So we become a kind of logo where our face is stamped across various platforms, various things that we use. It's tied to our banking identity, things like that. The idea that we are our own brands and that we can commodify ourselves seems to grow very naturally out of this demand on us that we always present ourselves clearly as who we are. This is who I am, across all media online.
Well, actually, talking about brands and identity, there was a very interesting discussion when the duo Daft Punk decided to retire about the possibility to make brands live forever. Actually, because under the mask of both musicians, you can put anyone, basically. Yeah. And it could have been a system of license to perpetuate the Daft Punk duo forever. And do you think that actually our digital selves can survive to our physical one through this commercialization or licensing of our identity and brand?
I love that. There's a really popular show in Britain called Doctor Who, where that character, a bit like James Bond, where the character of Doctor Who is played by different actors over the generations. So imagine if we were all like that, we could be regenerated and occupied by other people with appropriate licensing agreements. I hadn't heard that about Daft Punk. That's really brilliant. But there's an irony that brings up, I think, which you mentioned, which is, on the one hand, we're asked to be, anonymity is very discouraged. If we comment online, we have to comment increasingly legally so as ourselves. We have to declare who we are. Our various lives on the internet are matched up. So our Gmail links to our YouTube. So if you log into I had sort of an interesting experience at teaching where I was on my university's web mail and I hadn't really clocked that it was supported by Gmail. So then when I was on the classroom and I wanted to show the students a video, I loaded a YouTube video that I wanted to show them, but it was my YouTube, it was my personalized YouTube kicked into life. So all the recommended videos were from my private viewing, which was fine. There was obviously nothing compromising, but it was still a bit unnerving in a public professional setting to see what the algorithm thinks of you. So in that sense, it's very hard for us to hide behind other masks, because the way the technologies are all interlinked now, there we are again, there we appear, and even the architecture of Zoom that we all noticed in the pandemic was that we would go and try and see other people, and there we would be in the corner, our own face again. But what you bring up about the Daft Punk thing is this tension, this paradox between our own faces seemingly being inescapable and the fact that other people through digital technologies can manipulate our face. So I want to talk a bit about the technology of deepfakes, where machine learning and algorithm programs can take some footage of you and then make you say whatever you like. They can recreate your voice. You may have seen some famous ones where an actor in America doing an impression of Tom Cruise. The video of him doing the impression of Tom Cruise morphed so that as he spoke, his face became Tom Cruise's face and then back again to his original face. And so there's an amazing way in which we're being asked to be a brand, and our face is our fortune, and we can be influencers who are poster people for brands. But at the same time, it seems like we may in the future have less and less control over our image, that it can be manipulated and contorted by other people rather than ourselves. So we're being asked to show up and be consistent, so we can book an Airbnb in so everyone's happy with who we are and that we're not some anonymous freak. But at the same time, the authenticity of our own image even is being compromised by the huge capabilities of deepfake technology.
Well, actually, talking about deepfakes, I would recommend our watchers to have a look to Bill Poster's work, Spectre. It's a good introduction into deepfakes from a very artistic and punk perspective, actually.
Yeah, and there's lots of punky things coming out of this this increasing demand on the consumer citizen to have a face that's recognizable. You know, facial recognition technologies are being increasingly moved into civic space, into public spaces, that our faces are being watched and analyzed, often in order to train the AI programs, in order to give them the raw material to practice recognizing faces. So there's been lots of controversial cases all over the world where facial recognition cameras have been erected in public space without our consent or our permission. And why I bring up the punk example is that I've heard stories of people sort of using makeup to short circuit the facial recognition camera so that they can't be recognized. So there is a sort of a rebellion brewing about this insistence that you are your image, and how can we play with that, rebel against it. I mean, deepfake technologies they're deeply sinister, but they're also deeply beautiful. So I'm not surprised that artists who can work with this are hugely interested in it.
Well, that's fascinating. The makeup, the way we have to modify our physical aspects in real life, just making sure that we don't appear on digital networks, for example. That's really amazing. We've been talking about deepfakes and about facial recognition. What kind or other challenges do you think that artificial intelligence will bring towards our personal life on this fourth dimension in future months or years?
Yeah, I've just been thinking about this actually. Something that I want to write about now is I spoke earlier about the weird emotion of writing a postcard and thinking, why haven't they replied to it yet? And I think another emotion that hasn't been talked about so much is just the way in which the demand or the stresses on us of when every time we go online, we see a kind of portrait of ourselves presented back at us by algorithms. So there's a very clear example, a very literal example that I just talked about, where we go on Zoom and we see ourselves. There we are again. I can see at the moment a bigger version of me and then a little version of me, yet I'm talking to you. And I'm not sure why the architecture of digital technologies is so insistent on us seeing our own faces all the time. But there's a more subtle way in which we go online and see our own faces, which is the ways in which algorithms, which are collecting information, data on us all the time, are getting a sense of who we are and then or sort of recommending content back to us. And in a way, the content they recommend is a kind of portrait of us. It's kind of a biography of us. So if you take the example of TikTok, the newish social media platform, there is a For You page on TikTok, which every time you interact with the platform, watch videos, how long you'll watch a video, what type of videos you seem to like, the algorithm is always watching and scrutinizing you to think, who is this person? What are they like? And painting in real time a portrait of you that then gets presented back to you. And I joined TikTok recently just for the fun to see what it was about. And I noticed that because they had no real much information on me besides maybe my location, my For You page, when they didn't know me very well, was just the recommended videos were The Rock, you know, that actor, wrestler, I think, Dwayne Johnson, very famous. It was like The Rock, Billie Eilish, Ed Sheeran. And I thought that was TikTok's idea of a tabula rasa. You know, this is sort of the basic human arrives in the world and they'll be interested in The Rock, Billie Eilish and Ed Sheeran. And after that, they will refine their interests. So I thought that was funny. But we see this all the time. If you go on YouTube, on Facebook, any targeted advertising is offering an implicit portrait of who the algorithm thinks you are. And I think that can be a funny sort of stress on people as well. And there's a lot of controversy about that. So if the algorithm has determined that you're homosexual, for instance, then it may, the targeted advertising you would receive would have an LGBTQ plus content. But advocates have said this is a real double bind, because on the one hand, charities or organizations who want to reach out to a queer community in need to be able to know who they are and to reach them for outreach purposes. But on the other hand, say Facebook users in countries where homosexuality is criminalized could be receiving compromising content on their Facebook feed. And this all stems from this sense of the portrait that AI has of you. So there's a lot of ethical issues with this. And I just think beyond these extreme examples of being compromised criminally or put in some political danger, there is this slight constant stress of seeing how the algorithm is perceiving you and feeling, is this my identity? Like, you know, if you go on YouTube and you watch a video, how then you get more and more videos like that. And all of a sudden you think, is this me? Is this my life? I'm not this sort of person. All of a sudden the content is giving you one, you know, far right provocateur after another. And you've just clicked on something way downstream from that. And you think, is this who they think I am? So I think that needs to be talked about more, the way that we open our laptops, we pick up our phones, and there's a strange funhouse mirror in there of our own sort of slightly distorted face, to go back to that word, looking back at us.
Well, you've been mentioning the stress and also mental health related to new technologies. And recently I was listening to a very interesting podcast from a French journalist devoted on these moments when you don't have to do anything. So you don't have any requirement from your work, or you're absolutely free of your time. And she interviews all kinds of people to understand, from sociologists to artists or neuroscientists, to understand what happens with our life, our brain, our emotion when we don't have to do anything. And do you think that actually with our smartphone always with ourselves, do you think that we can still do nothing in a digital world? Can we remain silent in this fourth dimension?
It's hugely difficult. It's almost impossible, I think. And I think we see this in the debate. You know, public debate all the time is, you know, ways of retrieving some of that silence, and a lot of it just has to do with these sort of magazine top 10 tips, and it always has to do with, you know, leave your phone outside the bedroom, no digital technologies while you go to sleep, the light from the phone is very bad for you. But we have to recognize the addictive way in which these technologies have been developed. So if we're having trouble putting them away and experiencing silence, that isn't always necessarily our fault. That has been the goal all along, to keep us moving, to keep the traffic going, to keep the clicks and engagement going. So the whole thing has been designed to keep us going constantly. And what I find particularly funny is when the digital technology then tries to absorb the idea of meditation and mindfulness into itself. So the mindfulness app, I think, is one of the great, brilliant ironies of the 21st century, because you're still engaging in the technologies that your phone still knows what you're doing, so that they can recommend maybe chamomile tea to you in a targeted ad. That idea of silence is, I think it is impossible while engaging with digital technologies, and we have to find ways of turning them off. I mean, it's not that intellectually interesting, but I think as long as we're engaging with them, we aren't in a place of silence. It's a place of constant noise. And it is funny to see, as I say, that sense of the digital economy trying to adjust to our own burnout by offering these other products to help us with that burnout.
Absolutely. We have some minutes left before the end of this interview, and I wanted to know from you, how do you envision our identity in the near future? What kind of challenges do you think we would have to face?
One big thing I've been thinking about in terms of identity and identity formation is that maybe 5 or 10 years ago, maybe with the rise of Instagram, it was that it felt there was lots of words being bandied around, like the narcissistic generation, or that digital technologies were making us, our smartphones were making us narcissists. The very idea of the selfie, that we were always taking pictures of ourselves, and we were becoming sort of egomaniacs and narcissists because of these technologies, or that the technologies were revealing a narcissism that was always there. But if we want to use Freudian technology for this, or Freudian terminology for this, sorry, I don't think that the main problem with digital technologies is an ego-based one to do with narcissism. To me, what I notice in younger people that I teach, that their challenges in their identity is the extreme superego, in Freudian terms, that is being produced by the fourth dimension. So what I mean by the superego is the self-disciplining, self-policing aspect of the psyche, which understands the social norms and modifies and monitors our behavior. I think the younger generation, 20 years younger than me, they're not narcissists. I think they have very huge superegos that have been developed by the idea that at any moment, if they say the wrong thing online, it could haunt them forever. It could haunt their career prospects. One tweet from when they were 14 could mean they don't get a job when they're 22. So there's real fear about modifying behavior because they know the social, professional repercussions of it. So one of the things I want to think about going forward with identity is this problem of how do we manage walking around with the concrete, ironclad superegos that digital technologies are producing.
That's really interesting, and that's the first time we've approached this aspect from this angle. Just finishing one last question, as we are changing years. What would be your wishes, actually, in this virtual world, and or maybe some recommendation to our watchers to handle safely this revolution?
Yeah. Well, I think there needs to be a revolution within the revolution. My big wish would be for us to not believe that this word architecture, this architecture of the digital platforms like Facebook, like Google, that have grown up, Amazon, that have dominated, that their way of doing this amazing technology of communication, of connectivity, that their way is the only way. And that would be my main request, is to say that there are other ways that we could have this brilliant, genius technology and not have it anchored into this world of surveillance. Other writers have written brilliantly about that. And I was, for the research for my second book, Picnic, Lightning, I was talking to a developer who was interested in mental health, and he was developing mindfulness apps in a whole new way, which I sort of respected very much, because I said to him, just because we engage with this app, it doesn't mean that all our data has to go into the cloud and to be sold off by third parties, and so that ads can be targeted to us. And he said, no, there's no reason why we can't engage with the device and have pure privacy over that. And that's just a key, simple thing, that there are other ways of doing this, so that not every time we move around in a digitized space that it's tracked and surveyed for economic gain. That just doesn't have to be the way it is. So my New Year's wish is that different types of digital buildings are built that we can walk through, that aren't these sort of incessant shopping malls where we are both the product and the consumer. We can do it another way.
Thank you so much for these good wishes, actually, for the changing years. I'm afraid
Yes, Happy New Year.
we don't have much more. We don't have much time or more time to carry on with this amazing conversation. But in any case, we will be able to follow you on socials and on internet, on your calendar and your regular
Yes.
version on BBC. Thank you so
Yeah.
much, Laurence.
Oh, you're welcome. It's been so nice talking to you. Thank you very much.
And we'll keep in touch soon. Take care.
Bye for now.
Muchas gracias a todos por haber seguido este nuevo episodio de Future Intelligence, el programa dedicado al impacto de las nuevas tecnologías en nuestro cotidiano. Os recuerdo que podéis consultar en nuestra página web en www.britishcouncil.es las últimas conferencias y charlas como las de Karen Palmer, por ejemplo, o también de nuestros invitados en el XR Fest del año pasado en Fundación Telefónica. Os deseo lo mejor para este fin de año y estamos hablando de cara a 2022. Un abrazo fuerte. Adiós.